Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for joining on fantastic sunny day here in London. Great to have so many of you join today with Jo Verheyden as our very first expert as part of the new Spark series. So really delighted, Jo, you were able to take the time to share your insight and your knowledge with us today, which is great. I think we can probably get started. I know it's always a bit of messing around at the start of these calls, but let's kick off. So Jo, you have led transformation change and customer experience improvements in some of the UK's largest companies, as well as being a consultant at Accenture. So I guess what's unique about you is that you've seen both the in-house side and the external consultant side. And I'm sure you'll tell us today some of the differences that you see between the two of them when trying to deliver change. We're really keen to get your thoughts and interested to hear about what it's like to make that change happen within organisations of the size that you've dealt with. So one of the UK's largest domestic appliances insurance companies, and one of the world's largest telcos. So you're talking tens of thousands of people, but you've been successful in helping to change mindsets for thousands of people across the companies, as well as hit that balance of short-term targets versus long-term transformation goals, which is definitely not an easy task. So welcome, Jo. We're absolutely delighted to have you.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. So yeah, I'm delighted to be the one that kicks off the series.
Great. So Jo, today we're going to talk a bit more about your experience. I guess what we thought quite fitting to start the series was really sky high view. How do you even know where to get started? How do you run a successful transformation program when you're faced with fixing so many different areas? So maybe you could tell us a bit to introduce yourself, a bit about you and your career and how you ended up in this field.
Yeah, so to be honest, I think I've always been in change, regardless of what my job title has been. I've always driven change in my various roles. And that could be either for an external customer or for internal customers, which I consider quite important as well. So I started my career, I studied finance and accounting. So I've got a master's in finance and accounting, never worked a day in my life in that field. But I think it was good background to just get going. And I joined Accenture when I graduated. At the time, there was still Anderson Consulting, so it's quite a while back. But I joined them and I focused mainly on government sector and the really, really large implementation programs. So things like a new IT system for the Ministry of Finance in Belgium, which is about 30,000 people. And what I did in those programs was really focusing on the business change that is required to get people to use these new systems. So I think it was still in an era where we very much did process and people follow IT rather than the other way around. And I think both have pros and cons, but that's what we did. So there was a lot of business change required. And my role would have been anything from either coaching senior leaders to drive that change in their own organization, or really drive the full business change with training and communications and all those kind of good things, organization change, etc. And then after 6 years, I left Accenture and went to work for Vodafone. Again, huge organization, big corporate. I started in the Netherlands and then I kind of made my way through 4 countries for Vodafone. So in the Netherlands, I started in IT, really looking at the relationship between business and IT and making sure that IT really responds to the needs of the business, making sure that the business is clear about what they want, is nicely prioritized, so we know what to land in IT world, and that the requirements are clear and you really deliver what that business requests and really respond to their challenges. And then in Vodafone, I kind of ended up going to Doha, to Qatar, where there was a new startup. So I was literally like employee number 25 or something in that setting. And it was, again, I was working in IT, but it was very different in terms of it was setting up a new organization. And we kind of set ourselves the challenge to build the smallest IT team in the world. by using shared services and outsourcers across the globe. So really interesting startup phase, very different to what I'd done before, but very interesting again. And then I moved to Ireland, to Dublin, again for Vodafone, and there I was responsible for business operations. So that included anything from sales support, so looking at commission structures, sales admin tools, those kind of things, and projects for the business customers. So things like, how do you deliver a really good experience in a retail shop for a business customer? So those are the kind of things we looked at. And then Vodafone decided to do a big program. I think it is the biggest program that was ever attempted in the world at the time. So multi-billion program, yeah, multi-billion program to change out the CRM and billing systems, but they wanted to do that at a European scale. And Vodafone is really a business that's built on acquiring other companies. So there's lots of different variants out there, and they wanted to centralize that in one European system. I worked on that initially to make that case for the executive committee. So really before the program started, one of their key challenges was, how will this implementation improve things for the customer? So that's really when I started to do customer experience almost as a full-time job, and looking at, okay, let's define that. What will the system actually help us achieve from a customer perspective? And then unfortunately, the program did kick off, everything was going to plan, and then Vodafone decided to reprioritize their investments. So that program didn't get executed, and local companies, like local countries, really implemented their own systems. That kind of left me without a role in Vodafone at the time. So I joined Domestic in General, which is, as you said, a big insurer for domestic appliances. And so very different sector, financial services, regulated in a very strict way. And for Domestic in General, I kind of did the same journey. I joined in IT and I ended up doing customer experience. But so I joined looking again at that relationship between business and IT, prioritization, etc. In that process, I really defined a gap that Domestic in General didn't have a strong strategy at the time. And so doing prioritization without having that bigger picture of where you're going in mind is quite tough. So they asked me to go and help them develop the strategy. So we developed a 5-year strategy. One of the key things that came out of that was that the company was at the time extremely sales focused. And we really wanted to make that shift to become more customer focused and retention focused. There's a really strong business case. Obviously it's confidential what the business case is, but the value of retaining a customer is times whatever that I can't say in terms versus acquiring a new customer. So really important shift for the company. We reorganized as well to make sure that we could bring that to life. And that's when I started doing customer experience. So I set up the customer experience team for Domestic in General.
So that's fascinating, and maybe we'll dive into that some more, because I think there's always this case that I hear of, how do you convince the exec, how do you convince senior stakeholders to care about the customer, but when you can bring it back to a clear case like that, which actually says by improving the experience and holding on to them, it's worth X of going out and spending this money to try acquire new. It's a no-brainer, but it's amazing how hard that case can be to make.
Yeah, and it's quite like, you need to think it through from a financial perspective on what is that number. It's not that easy to come up with that number, and thank God we had some financial whiz kids helping us with that.
And so you've ended up in customer experience, and I have to ask you, I ask everyone this because I've never got the same answer twice. What does customer experience mean to you?
Just be really clear, I don't work for Domestic in General anymore, so I'm not speaking on their behalf. But what does customer experience mean to me? To me, I think it is anything really that a customer feels, sees, hears when dealing with your products and services. So it's really a multi-sensory thing, and it is not necessarily something that you can fully control. So I think definitely with social media being extremely powerful, so things that customers might read about your product from someone else on social media is still part of your customer experience. People will be setting certain expectations about your products and services by just reading that. So I think it's a massive challenge for companies to try and make that an intentional experience rather than an accidental one. But so yes, for me, it is anything a customer experiences across all your channels, across the entire life cycle. So even before they become your customer or after they've left, and even wider than your own channels.
And I guess, what are some of those key customer problems you saw, or also, you know, what really delighted customers?
So in domestic in general, because that's kind of my most recent customer experience. There were a few very kind of key problems that were fairly easy to identify. So one was, as I said, it was an extremely sales-focused company. And a lot of it is done on the phone, as in that's by far 90% of all business in domestic in general gets done on the phone. So at the time, I should say. What the result of that was that because it's so sales focused, agents on the phone will very quickly assess whether they can sell something, and if they can't, they'd pass you on to the next person. So customers would get passed around quite a bit. So that was one of the key issues, and obviously that's not something customers enjoy, having to restart their story, sometimes even have to start their identification process. So quite a lengthy journey to get to the person that's actually going to help you. Then the fact that it's so telephone based means that if you have a preference for digital channels, they might be a bit harder to find, but also not that intuitive to use. So one of the big hurdles in digital was, for example, the login. So quite the start of the journey. So that's a big problem. I think as a result, well, and I think the third major problem is probably around the repair journey, which is why you buy this policy, is that ultimately if your appliance breaks down, you get a repair or you get a new appliance instead. And that journey is not executed by domestic in general. So domestic in general works with the original manufacturers, which gives you really good experience because it's people that built the appliance that are coming to repair it, which makes the chance of repairing it the first time quite high. But it also meant that that whole experience was managed by the manufacturer. And so domestic in general would only know back in the day whether a repair was done when they got an invoice from the manufacturer. So whether an engineer had to come out once, twice, 3 times, it took 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, we wouldn't necessarily know that and therefore couldn't proactively manage that experience. And so from a customer perspective, you kind of end up in this domestic in general black box. And if you are unlucky and things do go wrong, then you kind of get bounced around between 2 companies, which is never a good thing. So those were kind of key issues, I think, that we dealt with.
So if I'm hearing, if my fridge, argument's sake, breaks down, I'm like, great, I have an insurance policy, we'll cover this. I call you domestic in general, sort it out. Yeah. Actually, on the inside, all this stuff is going on because there's a lot of it out of your control, engaging with the manufacturers. I don't really care about that. I just need my fridge.
Yeah. So the old experience would have been a very typical insurance experience, I guess, which is, great, we've got your fridge on record. Let me create an authorization code for you so you can go and call this number where you can arrange your repair. So okay. quite a disjointed experience, I guess.
Great. So it sounds quite a classic experience. Just pause for a second. I should have said we do have Q&A open. Thank you. We've one question already, which I'll come to in just a second. And please, if you have any questions for Jo, post them on there throughout our chat. So Jo, maybe going back then to your work at Domestic in General, what were some of the major projects that you worked on and, you know, saw success at?
So I'll start with the beginning of when we set up customer experience. Domestic in General at the time was looking at changing their product suite. So initially, there were kind of different types of plans and we wanted to make them all insurance plans, easy to understand, get rid of some real customer friction points. Like there were plans that would have a depreciation to it. So if your fridge would break down and 10 years later, the value of your fridge is virtually zero, then you wouldn't necessarily get a new fridge. You would get the value that's left of that fridge, which is a really bad customer experience. So we kind of changed products quite a bit. And at the time, there was a lot of regulatory change as well. So GDPR was coming in. There was the Insurance Distribution Directive, which was very specific about how you sell insurance to customers, et cetera, et cetera. So all these challenges were coming at us at the same time. And we knew we had to mobilize the entire company to respond to these challenges. And so what we said was, let's start with the customer, because we're now in this new world where we say the customer comes first. So we'll start with the customer journey. And we really mapped out every single journey to then say, this is what's going to change. And that went to all the teams, so they could all do things that go in the same direction from a customer perspective. So that was one of the big kind of changes that it was a big program. It was over a year to kind of really implement the end-to-end piece. But it all started with customer journeys, which was great. Then from that on, we did another program, which was looking at, again, the customer journeys, but taking that step improvement around the service and driving people to digital. But I'll talk a bit more about that later on, so I won't give it all away. Another big program we worked on was vulnerable customers. So we really did an inventory of what are the types of vulnerabilities that are relevant for our products and services in the countries that we operate in, and then said, where are our biggest risks for these different types of vulnerabilities across all our journeys. And so we kind of did an inventory of where are we exposed, where we're not responding to those needs. We also worked with a company that specifically does customer research with different types of vulnerable customers, just to make sure that our response to those vulnerabilities was correct. And I think one of the biggest things was, we need to be able to log the vulnerability. How do you have that conversation with a customer? How do you ask about vulnerabilities? Do you ask, or do you let them bring something up? And what do you log? How long can you keep it for? What can you keep it for? Can you share it with like a repairer that goes out, so they need the things they need to know? So quite a sensitive kind of program, but really important for a good chunk of the population, actually.
Yeah, I faced something similar when I was at BT, in terms of trying to define as well, even what do you mean by vulnerable? And there's some maybe temporary vulnerable, maybe like a heavily pregnant woman, compared to elderly, and you could have a very fit 80-year-old who doesn't show up when they're vulnerable. So even the definition can be quite hard.
And there's vulnerabilities that are very visible, but there's also vulnerabilities that are not. So like dementia. Should you be selling to people that have dementia, and how are you going to know? And so it's quite an interesting topic to discuss in detail.
It is. And just thinking about your customer journey, so I'm quite interested, you said you gave them out to each of the teams after a year. I know there's always a risk that you've produced the world's best PowerPoint journeys. How were they taken by the teams to make them a reality?
So it didn't take us a year. We kind of took a month and a half to just churn out about, I think we did 17 different workshops to get to those customer journeys. Ada didn't exist beforehand, so it was baselining them as well, and then looking at these changes that were coming. We didn't really have to hand them out because we had those people in the room. So we always made sure we had a huge number of stakeholders in the room to discuss things with, where we had fantastic ideas. So we never blocked any idea around this is how we could do things. We never blocked them, but we did focus on the outcome, because it was regulatory change, etc. has got strict deadlines, so we had deadlines to meet. But we would keep them in a kind of parking lot for later on, which was great for our further kind of program, because we had this inventory of here's all the things that we could look at to improve further from those workshops. But so yes, we did have quite a wide range of stakeholders in the meeting, and they would then take that back to their departments. So it wasn't necessarily, here's a PowerPoint with everything we've discussed, off you go. It was more you were in the room, so you can take it back to your departments, and we're always here to help and follow up on the implementation, so you don't deviate too far from what we agreed.
Great. And I think that's actually really timely to questions that's been asked by Anonymous. Fascinating career, Jo. You really have done it all. Do you find that the C-suite listen more to change strategies or recommendations when they come from an internal employee or from an external consultant?
It's interesting, because I think the combination of both is probably the strongest. So when I worked at Accenture, it would be very rare that it would just be a bunch of consultants doing a program. So we would always work with people from the governmental department or the business that we were working with. We would always have people in the room, because you cannot have that knowledge that internal people have in a matter of months. So I think the combination is quite strong. At the same time, if you are in a company for quite a while, you might start considering things as true that are actually not, but they're just these myths that have been living in the company for ages. And so someone independent that just goes like, why are you saying that? Where's the proof of this, et cetera, is quite strong as well. So to me, it wouldn't be either or. If you really need to make a fundamental change, it is probably the combination that is the strongest. If it is smaller change, then I think an internal employee should be just as convincing as a consultant. And I would personally think an internal employee probably knows better what they're talking about quickly and can answer questions a lot better.
Great. So maybe you can elaborate on who were your main stakeholders? Who were you dealing with?
So to me, in my role in domestic in general, my main stakeholders were obviously the channels that deliver to the customer. So contact centers, digital, but also our service team, which is basically a team that manages the relationship with the repair networks. So they were the biggest stakeholders. They were always involved in everything because they were ultimately the channels to deliver it to the customer. But it definitely doesn't stop there. I think finance, sales, risk and compliance, IT, there's so many stakeholders across the business. And if you start thinking during your design what it would mean for implementation, then you can pull those people in early on in the journey.
That's great. And how did you pull them into the journey? How did you engage them?
So I think there's no kind of silver bullet here. Some are easier to engage with than others, but I do think engage early on, not just in a program, but engage frequently and constantly with people without having a direct need necessarily. So don't wait for that project where you then have an operational need and you need to kind of speed things up, but build that relationship on an ongoing basis. I think it's a much easier basis to then do projects on. The other thing I would say is involve people as early as you can in your program, and make them really understand why this is important, but also have a feel for what are their priorities. And I think it goes quite far. Like in the contact center, for example, we were extremely keen to collect email addresses from customers because it would mean we could do electronic documents. It would mean we could do promotions. We could send service reminders. So things like, have you done your descaling or whatever, that kind of stuff. We could do so much with it. But from a contact center perspective, all they could see was it's going to take 20 seconds on every call to collect an email address. That's a cost of whatever. And it goes completely against our targets to manage the average handling time of a call. So I think understanding really what their priorities are, how they are measured, and kind of work together to see how you can tackle the challenges that you've got from a customer perspective, I think is really important. So yeah, that'd be
great. And then I guess with what you've achieved at domestic in general, what did success look like to you, or what were some of the results?
So one of the big programs that I co-sponsored was, we called it DGX, which was Domestic and General Experience. That's what it stood for. And it was big. The whole intention was, let's improve the customer service journeys. So anything from a complaint, a repair, a replacement, all those kind of journeys, just customer queries as well, and try and move some a bit more digitally. So it all started with, we'd just done our program to improve the customer experience, and people were really enthusiastic, and the culture massively changed in the company where people were customer focused, but it also meant that people were starting to do things in pockets. So like digital would be focused on, oh, how can we build the best repair journey? So like you get your calendar and you can find time slots, etc. The contact center was talking about how can we change our scripts so they're a lot more customer friendly, but none of it was joined up or end to end.
Mm-hmm.
So digital would do these big investments in their digital journey, but unless customers know about the fact that you've got that journey available and what details they need to have ready, etc., it's not being used. It's kind of a really great investment, but it doesn't deliver anything. So we set up this program to start bringing all these initiatives together and look at an end-to-end view. So that was what we called the domestic and general experience. It was big, and I do think we made some mistakes, but we kind of built the program around 4 key pillars. So one was, let's look at the journey agnostic of any channel. So things like in a complaint journey, we really don't communicate with the customer. It doesn't even matter whether you did a digital complaint or a telephone complaint. Once you're in the system, you're in the system, and we would kind of leave you there, obviously dealing with the complaint, but not keeping you necessarily up to date throughout that journey. So those kind of improvements came under the customer journey pillar. Then we had one that was specifically about digital and driving digital awareness and develop that journey. We had one that was around e-docs. So
Around what, sorry?
E-docs, so electronic documentation.
Okay.
So anything from sending simple things like policy documents, renewal letters, just electronically. But I had quite a few challenges from a regulatory perspective. And then the last pillar was the contact center operating model in that whole context. And I think you can tell already from what I've been talking about, the 4 pillars were quite different in size, which I think was probably one of the things we should have considered better. We had 3 sponsors on this program. So there was myself from a customer experience perspective, but we also had someone from the contact center and someone from digital sponsoring, which meant that it was a really strong message to the rest of the organization that it wasn't being done to them. It was actually a joined up thing that we did. We launched quite big with a really strong story. So we first had EXCO and board approval for this program. And then we have, like in domestic and general, there's a quarterly event with kind of the top 40 leaders in the business. So we launched it there. And then from there, we went to all the town halls of the different departments. There's quite a bit of nervosity, I guess, around going to the contact centers, because when you talk about driving traffic to digital, they might be worried about their jobs, etc. And to be fair, the story was so strong that they were like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. That's absolutely what we should be doing for the customer. And our jobs will change. We will have different types of queries. We will be able to do chat conversations that we don't do today. So like they're really sort of positive in it. It was great. All these pillars had a leader, and then they would really organize themselves. So they would set up working groups for different topics that would fall into their pillar. And it was quite collaborative, but quite empowering. So it wasn't like someone tells you this is your next deliverable. What we did instead at a program level was track our deliverables, outcomes. So what is happening to our complaints? Are they coming down? What's happening to NPS? Is it going up? What is happening with call volumes? Are they coming down? So it was more the outcomes that we were tracking. And so within the working group, you could say, actually, these are the 5 things I have to deliver as an outcome. Are the things that I've got scheduled to do, delivering that or not? And so you get quite an agile approach around testing something, doesn't work, ditch it, rather than a delivery program that has really strict deliverables without kind of keeping the outcome in mind. And then we did weekly reviews, and it worked. All that worked quite well, I think.
I really like that. So you're saying after the initial sponsorship by the board in the EXCO, actually it was real empowerment at the working group level and accountability to get the results, but kind of both setting the results and the way to achieve them within the working group.
Yeah, and it takes quite a lot of upfront work, I think, to build that business case in a way that it's outcomes based for the different work streams. So yeah, and I think the other one of the biggest challenges is probably, can you get the data in such a way that you know cause and effect?
Yeah, great. Just going to jump across to the chat. We have a question from Mairead. So Mairead asks, what advice do you have for making the case for customer experience investment in the face of in-year sales and trading obsession? So, you know, it's a no-brainer. We should be customer first, and 3 to 5 years will be totally transformed. but at the same time, you have short-term quarter targets you need to report to the city. So you
Yeah,
must have seen that in a company that size.
absolutely. And Domestic and General is privately owned, so you kind of go through investment cycle. It's not privately open, is private equity.
Yeah.
So you go through investment cycles, and so yes, there is a bit of pressure to get things done when you come near the end of a cycle. So I think really it's the longer term plan that you need to have in mind, and that's what you need to build your cases on. But you have to find quick wins. You have to show that there will be value, and I think you can in every program there are quick wins. So that's how we did it. Our first phase was full of quick wins.
So you had the long-term vision for where you wanted to go, the 3 to 5 years, but then aligned to that, you would look for what you could achieve here and now. And you also talked about experiments as well, right?
Yeah, so a lot of A/B testing, definitely in digital, you can test so much so quickly. So a lot of A/B testing, a lot of quick wins. I think it's also good for the morale, like keeping people engaged in a 3 to 5 year program is quite tough if you can't show interim results. So I think it is that mix of, yes, you will have the bigger, longer term challenges, work on them, but don't just work on those, do some short term stuff as well.
Great. And you spoke a bit there about going back, there's probably some things you would have done differently. So I personally like to think of FAIL, FAIL, about being fanatical about incremental learning. There's a learning opportunity everywhere. So what would you have done differently? What were your takeaways?
I think the biggest failures I've faced are all related to data. And like, I think any company probably struggles quite a bit with data, but when you use data, understand what the context was in which it was gathered. So what was the sample size? What was the method that they followed? Why did they gather it? I think it gives so much insight. So things like, I was working on the complaints journey, and it seemed like the complaint volumes. So a year before, 2 years before, the continuous improvement team in the contact center had done an exercise where they were kind of looking at, if you log complaints correctly, so you really filter out not something that someone, so in Domestic and General, a lot of complaints were raised because an agent would need to get rid of the issue rather than deal with it on the call because they were so sales focused. So they did this exercise looking at complaints and kind of saying, what is actually not a complaint? It's just overlogging done by the contact center. And they came up with this number. And obviously that number stuck in the exco's head quite rapidly. And then there was me doing the exercise. And so it seemed like that was the number to work towards, because that exercise was already done. When actually, when you started looking into it, they took one complaint reason and they took it from one type of source only. So like, complaints is a lot more complex than what they'd done, but that number was stuck in people's heads. So you kind of need to be aware of that uphill battle, I think, which I wasn't. So that's definitely one that I learned a lot from. The other one was around, we did a lot of improvements on the repair journey, and it just didn't reflect in repair complaints coming down. And it's always a bit of a baffling thing, like, why is that? Are we doing the right things? And one of the key reasons is that when call volumes increase, more complaints get raised just because people can't deal with the query, and because there was no kind of proper query journey, they would raise a complaint. So it was just a kind of procedural thing in the contact center. The other thing is, we had 300 complaint reasons that people could log. They always logged the first 5.
Yeah.
So we were never going to see shifting the dial if we just looked at those numbers. And I think so data, I think, is always one to be careful with. It can trip you up so quickly.
And that's quite interesting, because that's nearly data as a benchmark or as a communication method, what gets understood about what's happening.
Yeah.
So making sure everyone's really on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. And then I guess for customer experience, for anyone who's building a career in transformation, what advice would you give? What does success look like to you in the role?
Well, to me, success is really leaving a legacy. Leave something in a better state than you found it. I think that is ultimate success to me. What that means in reality, I think, is set some bold goals. Like, don't shift the dial a tiny bit, because you're not necessarily going to see the effect. I think customer experience improvements are quite long-term improvements. And so if you're not kind of audacious enough in your goals, you're never going to find cause and effect. So be bold, I think, is one that I would say. And then obviously achieving those goals is the ultimate success, right? But I think a lot of those improvements, people don't necessarily stay long enough in a role or a job to see that through to actual results.
Great. I'm going to jump across to the questions again. So Anonymous, there's two from Anonymous, and I don't know if they're the same. One is Mackin. I think he says it's a really inspiring story that you've written. I think it's the same, because the second person says it's a really inspiring story that you have written, putting customers first and improving their experiences. What is the number one piece of advice that you have received or given to someone that helped you in your work and in transformations?
I think in transformation, you cannot over communicate. I think a lot of people in my teams felt a bit like we're doing the design and then it goes to the channels to implement and they celebrate the success. And I think just communicating what you're working on, why you're working on it, why it is important, and the small achievements and the big achievements. Don't wait for the huge one, but also try to make it a little bit of fun. I think customer experience is it touches nearly every part of the business, and so you have all these interactions that you can make really fun. And so, like when we talked about goals, one of the goals that we had in my team was we were going to win an award.
Yeah.
Like we were going to do such a great improvement that somewhere someone was going to say, yeah, that this is worth an award from an independent body, not internally. But yeah, that was one of our ambitions.
Did you?
No. I left.
It's really fun.
It might have by now. I left the company, so I can't, don't know.
Yeah, but you get the awards dinner, you get to go to all of that, so that's fun,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And it's kind of, I think awards are great anyway, because you hear what other companies are doing. It's great atmosphere, and it's kind of a nice treat for the team.
Yeah, that's great. And another question here from Elaine. Thanks, Elaine. So great talk on delivering real business change and engaging people in the organization and how to do it. Her question is about how to sustain long-term customer improvement after the program, or, you know, this great momentum goes and it gets delivered on its scope. So what tools and mechanisms can you put in place to keep the momentum after that kind of initial phase of activity? And how do you keep people motivated?
So to me, long-term sustainable change is part of your culture. So we did huge work in domestic in general around changing the company culture. And I think that's how you really embed it. So it's not that people have to do it, but they want to do it, which makes a massive difference. Obviously, you can embed certain changes in the way people are measured, which is always a good incentive for people to do what you want them to do. But I think the real meta change is where you've made it part of the culture. So we did a huge program to work on that culture. So it starts with mission, vision, values, behaviors. But then we also did a momentum plan, and it was a year plan. So a whole year of activities that would bring a customer first culture to life. And they're not fluffy things. They're not like, oh, we're going to communicate X, Y, Z. It is things, it's harsh decisions at some stage. Things that in the short term don't really necessarily work for the financials of the company, but they will in the long term. So we did things like we removed delivery charges on new appliances. That is a cost to the business because you have to absorb that delivery charge. But in the long term, you'd hope that customers, they get a better experience, and they might actually insure their new appliance as a result of it. So they're really concrete things. They're things like at the Exco, we now discuss a customer dashboard every month. It's not just a token thing. We discuss it and we debate where we think the issues are. We had little things in there as well, so but they're very tangible, like changing the dress code. So I think that whole year plan was really the secret around doing good cultural change, because it made it real. And the other thing we did was we had this network of change agents in the company. So we started with a smaller group of people across the company that we said they're really good change agents. They get this change. They get what we want to achieve with the culture. We called them firelighters. So our program was called Ignite.
Firelighters.
Yes, our change agents were called firelighters, and then they got so enthusiastic and they built their own little networks of change agents in their departments, and they were called Sparks, which is so we had this network of people that would just drive that change, and they'd come up with their own activities. So we had our year momentum plan with the big things, but they did constantly things in their departments, and it really was brought to life, I think, remarkably quickly.
Okay, so firelighters and sparks. And
firelighters and sparks, make it part of the culture and make it part of how people are measured. And so one of the things on our momentum plan was when the new performance year kicked in, everybody had a kind of dashboard with 4 topics for which they had to have targets, and one was customer.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question. It's anonymous again. Have you any examples of where a company you have worked for has introduced transformation or innovation that is technology or digital based rather than meeting a customer need? So you're kind of doing it for the sake of the technology rather than for the sake of the customer, and then you're trying to fit it backwards, shoehorn it to a customer need.
So I think that was probably more done in my Accenture days. I don't know whether it was a trend then to look at technology and then retrofit the business. But the obvious reason was, like, if you do big SAP implementations, any customization costs money, and you have issues when you want to upgrade, etc. So we would do a lot of those implementations where you use a system as much as possible out of the box, and then retrofit processes and people.
And what would you say, you know, having seen both of those, where you have this great piece of kit, let's force it on the customer, versus developing a solution around the customer needs, what would you see in terms of results?
They both work, but I think so they worked for internal customers. Let me be very clear. It was always a system for the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance needs to work with it, not necessarily citizens that are doing their tax applications, etc. I think it works for internal customers, possibly better than for external customers. I do think it is important to understand the customer expectation. If you completely miss it, there's no point implementing this fantastic system that doesn't respond to anybody's need.
Great. Sorry, I had a helicopter flyby. That's great. And then another question is, going back to the points you were making about changing company culture can take time and years. How could you accomplish that cultural change for a change to last, and on what lead time is that feasible? So you spoke about your year plan.
So we did a year plan to start with, and then when the year was over, we made sure that we celebrated the year being over. Was it luck, or did we do it really well? But our employee engagement score went up 15% in that year. So once you have something like that to celebrate, it's easier to keep momentum going. And then obviously you need to build this in your onboarding program for new employees, so they're just in that already from the start. But yeah, so I think in a year you can achieve a lot, but don't let it go then. We built another momentum plan for the next year.
Okay, great. So it's not a one-off activity. I think
you have to keep working at it. Yeah.
And how much support was from top down versus this grassroots movement of firelighters and sparks?
So we made sure, definitely at the start of the program, that the importance of culture and the cultural frameworks of the mission, vision, values, behaviors were repeated at big events. So if the CEO would stand up and talk to people, it would always be part of it. And I think people should be able to not see the image to know what it is. They should just know it. And by repeating it a lot, that really works. Yeah, I think it is continuous work. I can't, like, we did something at the end of the year. We also switched up the firelighters a bit, so they didn't have to, like, because it's also work for them, that it comes on top of their day job. So we switched them around a bit so they could take a break and someone else could have a go at it when they were really interested. So you kind of need to keep interest going.
Great. So this is a community, or what we're establishing with Spark. Spark was set up earlier this year to bring together people working in transformation and customer experience who are actually making change happen within their organizations. I guess, what one topic would you share with the group as a community?
Well, I think the topic that we discussed quite a bit would be cultural change and the importance of it, and how to go about it. And I think we did it fairly successfully. We did work with an external company, by the way, to make it that success. But yeah, I think that would be the one topic that I think isn't necessarily just change and transformation. It's kind of a bit more of a niche topic.
A bit more, so focusing in on the culture.
Yeah.
And if you had one ask of this group and anyone who's on the call, what would that be?
Obviously, I'm on a career break, so I don't have an urgent business problem that I need to fix. But I think what I think from my perspective, the big programs that we've done, I've always had lessons learned. And I think I haven't cracked it yet on what is the perfect way to organize large scale transformation. So be interested in that and what challenges there are and how people have overcome it. I think that would be really interesting.
Okay, well, if anyone has any particular thoughts or wants to reach out after the call, it'd be great to connect.
Yeah, I think I've got one other one, which is kind of the tension that might exist between customer experience and operational teams. So, like, how do you avoid that ivory tower kind of feel of a customer experience team that is designing lovely things and then just goes to the operation and says, this is what you have to do next, when actually they've got targets, they are the experts in what they do. How do you kind of balance that, and how do you split those roles and responsibilities?
Okay, it'd be great to hear if anyone on the call either wants to share some thoughts now in the Q&A or follow up afterwards. So it'd be great to continue the discussion.
Yeah.
And finally, are there any, where do you stay up to date on your inspiration, up to date on your trends, anything we should be following?
So what I've enjoyed recently is the HEC Paris, it's the University for Advanced, like MBAs and stuff. They've been doing quite a few webinars recently, especially in the light of COVID-19. And so there's been a few around how does it affect an operating model in an organization. There's been some financial ones as well, but I think they are really interesting, and it comes from people that are experts in their fields. So I think they do really interesting stuff, and it's still running, so people can still sign up to them. I think there's 3 at the beginning of June. So definitely, I've kind of, it gives a fresh perspective, I think, on the pandemic and what's happening and how people are responding to that. I would say awards are always good, and there's quite a few virtual ones at the moment, so easy kind of to put yourself up as a judge or just to read what the winners did, etc. Other companies. So I've done a call a week ago, and a lady from Aviva was on the line. I find that super interesting. I want to know what other companies are doing. Similarly, when I was working on complaints in domestic in general, I went to see a couple of other companies to see how do they organize themselves to deal with complaints effectively. So so other companies, I think, are always a great source for information. And then if there's a topic that you're really interested in, I think Coursera, which is online courses, they are brilliant. And you can learn anything from how to play the guitar to data science. I've done a few of them, and I think they're really good. They are from professors in their field, so that it's really, really solid, I think, education.
Brilliant, thank you. Guys, that's about it for the questions. If anyone has any last questions, probably take a minute or two to answer them. Unfortunately, I can't see if anyone is typing a question, but if not, we will thank you very much, Jo, for your time. So thank you, Thomas. Well done, Helen and Jo. So again, thanks. Hopefully this was of use. We will have, like I said, we're just kicking off the expert series, so hope to continue these every week with a different expert in the field. So actually, if you have any questions, if you either drop a line at hello@wearespark.io or on Instagram, or just hear as to what else you would like to hear, that would be great to arrange other sessions. But in the meantime, Jo, you've been very busy traveling the world. It's except now the corners of your house and the boundaries. So we wish you all the best for your career break, and hopefully you'll get back to exploring the world very soon. And thank you for being so open today. That was extremely valuable.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, great. Okay, take care. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.